This is Milkshed here. Regardless of your leanings on the political spectrum, it's impossible to deny the vast shortcomings of the modern American news cycle. So, most of you, if you're listening to me at all, have probably noticed a pattern in discourse as far as when national tragedies emerge. There's kind of a gold rush to attack this information and to insert your narrative into the news cycle. This goes for both the left and right. It's more a problem of the left though, I think, because say for example the Las Vegas shooting, they wanted to insert the opinion not so much of guns, although the gun debate was certainly erected during the Las Vegas shooting. However, I think the main debate that they were trying to make, you're not willing to call a white man a terrorist. You're only willing to call Islamic attacks terrorism, whereas there's no, they weren't willing to. The reason there wasn't that wasn't considered a terrorist incident is because there was no instance of. There was no evidence of a motive, okay? There was no note, there was no motive, there was no discernible reason that he committed this tragedy. But as far as... well, the thing is, the legal definition of terrorism requires a political or religious motive. So, for that reason, it can't be considered terrorism. However, this most recent school shooting in Parkland, Florida, which was worse in casualties than Columbine and has remained in the political discourse in kind of news circulation for a long time. I think it's almost been a month, not quite, but almost been a month. That's a very long time for something like this to be in a news cycle. It's almost as much as the I was pretty young back then. I wasn't paying attention. I'm not gonna give out my age on this, but I was too young to give a shit about news cycles and news patterns and stuff like that. But the Sandy Hook massacre, it's receiving about as much publicity and discussion and news coverage as that. So the main, like I said, there's a gold rush, a rush to insert, and the main debate here, which has reached apex, I think, hysteria. The main debate here is, of course, the Second Amendment, and this video is going to discuss why I don't think, it's under attack certainly, but why I don't think it's really in danger. Now, of course, we haven't seen a terrible legislative attack on firearm ownership in a while. It's been since the 90s when the federal assault weapons ban, which was completely unconstitutional, by the way, and it banned the AR-15. Might I add that Columbine occurred during this ban, so they didn't use the AR-15 in Columbine, so banning the AR-15 would not have done anything, as Columbine has proven. Another thing that's happening is, so as to why it's not under attack, contrary to what many of you probably believe, the issue of gun control is not a popular one. People are not, there are certainly gun owners on both sides of the political spectrum. Now formerly Democrats, but now, they're still Union Democrats, the people in the Rust Belt, those who voted for Trump but were safe Democrats before. They're commonly gun owners too, but up until this past election, they were safely Democratic voters, and they, of course, might support some higher taxes, pro-union policies, but they won't support gun control. That's not going to happen. And people hold the Constitution, rightfully so, to a high regard, and people see it set in stone. That's it. That's done. And that's how I see it. But the layman sees it that way as well. So that's a good thing for Second Amendment rights. So another argument that the left likes to use is that a bunch of politicians like to are paid off by the NRA, and that's the only reason they will support constitutionalism at all. And I think that's fucking retarded, because the NRA, while yes, they're a lobbyist group and they will pay their way into, gaining their self-interests, but excuse me, the extent to which they're gonna pay. Hold on, excuse me. Okay, I've returned. So bump stocks, or not bump stocks, I'll get to that in a second, but the NRA pays, I think, a few grand per speech, maybe to a congressman or a senator or something like that. They pay, I think the most they've paid to a single person, now not organization, but to a single politician, is like less than 20 grand, and that's nothing. That's chump change. That's nothing. So they're not the most powerful lobbyist group. The idea that they're the ones controlling, they're in the pockets of all of Congress is bullshit. That argument fundamentally is flawed. Now, obviously, the people calling for gun control, and I think the politically apathetic realize this, those calling for gun control know little to nothing about guns themselves. They will say, well, these are the AR-15 that they used was a dangerous semi-automatic weapon, and they will use terms like semi-automatic without having any idea of what they mean. I'm sure if you're listening to me, you know what that means. Semi-automatic, one pull, or the legal definition says one action of the trigger produces one bullet. So that's handguns, like a Glock 19, the most popular police arm. That would be you guessed it, a semi-automatic weapon. That basically, that's all guns except revolvers, bolt-action, lever-action rifles, and shotguns, basically. So, yeah, I mean, they don't necessarily know what that means. They hear semi-automatic, they just hear automatic, and they think it's a machine gun, where it's not. They'll call for the banning of bump stocks, even though they're not really used in mass shootings. And the thing is, I think it's silly. I think it's ridiculous to base legislation on the outlier, and this is very much the outlier. The deaths, the violent deaths that are coming from, let's say, gun homicides and gun attempted homicides, for argument's sake. It's in the single digits as for the percent of let me rephrase this. Rifles are not committing virtually any of these murders. It's all handguns, but no one's calling for the banning of a handgun. Yes, mass shootings happen, but they're not as common as just gang violence and gang homicides and stuff like that. And that's the majority. It's stupid to base legislation on, say, something like Parkland, where that rarely ever happens, instead of looking at the bigger picture, where this is happening with handguns overwhelmingly. Now, I do think the left wants to, regardless of what they say, they're going to say, well, we're pro Second Amendment, but these are weapons of war, and it's unreasonable. This is a common sense legislation. They like to say that a lot too. No, it's not common sense, because fundamentally, the Constitution, the purpose of it is to defend against a tyrannical government. So, in order to do that, isn't it logical to assume that the arms required by the militia, the arms owned by the militia, should rival or equal that of the military, right? Shouldn't it? And people say, for example, I think it was James Monroe that said that the militia, the militia should be 5 times the size of that of the armed forces, and people are like, well, look what happened to that, but it's much more than 5 times larger. The militia, in the legal sense, is considered just any able-bodied American who has a gun, And there are a lot more of that than active duty military, I can tell you that much. There are a lot more people just with guns in the country than there are people involved in the armed forces. That is a definite truth. I'm not sure on the exact numbers of that, but there are tens and tens of millions of people in the United States that own guns, legally or not. Then I think the 3 or 4 million total enlistment in the military. So, yeah, regardless of what they say, if they say they're pro-Second Amendment, they want common sense reform, it's not true. I think if they had their way, they'd do away with the Second Amendment completely, which, of course, would result in armed revolution, which would tear the country to shreds. And people are saying, well, this country has nukes and stuff. Like, who's to say that some militia could overthrow the government? First of all, you're not recognizing that many of these soldiers would not... Excuse me. About to burp. Okay, cool. Would not support the killing of civilians. There will be schisms within the United States military were there to be. Okay, let's say there's an Australian-style buyback program, which is so fundamentally unlikely. Let's just say it happens because that's what the left wants. Yeah, there would be armed revolt. Like, people would not give up their guns, and if they would, like they could just say, yeah, I don't have that gun, and they're not gonna acquire a warrant. It's not gonna happen. They're not gonna get a warrant to search the house and find guns because that's not probable cause, and there's no judge in their right mind would give out a warrant like that. That's when the government would need to become tyrannical and would justify such a revolution. I think if there was a buyback program, you would have a revolution and the country would not exist anymore. And people would always say, well, you know, the militia could never beat the United States military. Yes, it fucking could, because the military is not really built for urban or they're not built for warfare in a country with developed infrastructure like the United States. It's not how they train, first of all. I mean, and the Vietnamese farmers who had no training whatsoever were able to fend off the U.S. military at its might in the 60s and 70s. They had nukes too. Well, we had. I'm not going to say the Vietnamese farmers didn't have nukes, obviously, but I mean, we had nukes back then too, and but they're not going to nuke the civilian population. It's never going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And I can't imagine soldiers going in there and just gunning down, like people would have moral, like they just wouldn't do that. The soldiers would be like, hell no, I'm not gonna go mowing down innocent civilians who are just trying to defend their rights. It's not gonna happen. And another argument that's used all the time is, well, the framers of the Constitution never would have anticipated the rate at which weapons fire now. They're like, well, you know, like they just had muskets back then and stuff. Well, you know, we had a musket back then. Like they'll do that, but the founding fathers were drafting the Constitution as the Industrial Revolution was revving up, and I mean they were seeing all this development, and they were fans of. The thing is, like they advocated for the United States military. I mean the militia to have similar arms to that of the military, because they want. Well, should our government become tyrannical, and they recognize that it could and probably would, we need a means for the population to overthrow said government. Another argument, Second Amendment wasn't meant for individual ownership, but for the communal ownership, i.e. it's a well-regulated militia. That's not what that means back then. I'll get into that later, but no, there was a Supreme Court case in 2008, District of Columbia versus Heller, that settled this constitutional issue. It does include private ownership, so that's over. That's not even a thing. So, yeah. Now, I'm not going to advocate for the solution. I don't think the solution to this issue is arming teachers. I think knowing teachers, it's not fair to saddle them with the responsibility to defend with their life the children. That's not their job. That's not their responsibility. I think that's a stupid argument by the right. It's never going to happen. Where are you going to find the funds for that? Pragmatically, morally, it's not going to work. Because You can't find the funds for it, first of all. It's morally reprehensible. It's not fair that the teachers should have to do that. Now, if you want to get the same exact effect, you can just hire security personnel. But Parkland, Florida, if you've read up on Parkland at all, the high school, they had security personnel, they had people riding around the campus at all times, people constantly patrolling the halls and stuff, with walkie-talkies, constantly clearing areas, saying this area is clear, no threat here. It did nothing. It didn't prevent anything. They were still able to get in there and shoot 17 some odd people. And I mean, this sounds bad, but if you want to live in a free society, there's very little you can do to stop this. And instead of laying the blame at the feet of innocent law-abiding gun owners and lobbyist groups like the NRA, which I don't agree with, by the way. I don't like money being in politics, and influencing elections and influencing campaigns. I don't like it. I don't like the NRA, although I support their agenda. I don't like lobbyist groups. Though this is the case, don't lay the blame at the feet of them, but lay the blame at the feet of Nicholas Cruz and the FBI, because the FBI, they received constant tips about this. The police was at his house like 40 times or something, some ridiculous fucking number like that. But they were at his house all the time. They received tips like, hey, this guy's gonna shoot up the school. He was on his YouTube account. He said, I'm gonna be a school shooter. They did nothing about it. They did nothing. They didn't follow up at all when it was pretty easily like people were coming up with a fucking case on a silver platter. Here's this school shooter. They did nothing about it. And for that reason, the FBI is largely to blame for this. Alright, one more thing. Don't listen to the kids from Parkland, Florida, who suffered through the shooting. Just because they were there and they heard gunshots or whatever, and they happened to be in a different building of the school at that time. I know the media and the public has given them absolute moral authority, but they have no credibility. They have just as much credibility as I do, and that's none at all. Don't listen to fucking me, because I don't have any degrees. I'm just a fucking kid with an iPhone who records on his phone. I don't have any credibility, but I'd like to think I know what I'm talking about. But you don't have to think that, obviously. These kids don't know anything more about guns than I do. Or, well, no, that's not true. I know more about guns than they do, but than a lot of them do. But they're no more qualified to speak about it than any of you. And for that reason, don't let them have the absolute moral authority that they do. Their perceived credibility is false. It's not true. Just because they survived through this does not make them more qualified to speak on the subject. I'm out. Have a good one.